You are listening to the second episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast series. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer and provoked by a lot of the foolishness that I've seen in this year's presidential election. I am Deji, the host of the Class of Hope and Change podcast. You can check out more of the information about our podcast at ClassofHC.com. We're also at ClassofHC on all the social media channels. For those who are listening to this episode for the first time, thanks for listening. We'll explain kind of what's going on here in a second. For those who've been listening, rocking since the first episode, we appreciate you for sticking with us. So basically, for those who are new, the Election Clapback podcast, like I said, was inspired by a good book that I read. It's called Economix, Economix, by two gentlemen by the name of Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. It was a really good book. It's kind of a comic book take on the history of the American economy. Really learned a lot about it and got more out of that in just a couple weeks that I read the book than I did from the whole past year of watching the news. And so that was both pretty inspiring and then also pretty frustrating. So that book and some of the thoughts that I had motivated this podcast series. And I felt like if we could share some of these thoughts that I was having and maybe that other people had with the broader country, maybe we could set up a different space outside of what we're getting from our media, or at least the large media, and have a different conversation where we can actually exchange ideas and learn something that actually helps your life and my life. So that's kind of the spirit in which the podcast series has started, and we're open to all good people of goodwill and good sense. And so we're just trying to move in that way. Last time, you need to go back and check out episode 1. We talked about capitalism and the free market. I'm really just picking up a few concepts from the book and just trying to share some of the principles with everybody who may not have time to read a 300-page comic book on economics. Also trying to dispel a lot of the myths in terms of labels that we hear get thrown around and people use them and they don't even often know what they mean. So last time we talked about capitalism and the free market, and today we're going to focus on corporations and big business. First things first, what is a corporation? So the book Economix, which is again the inspiration for this podcast, and for those who are listening for the first time, I don't know the authors. I'm not part of any promotion team. I'm not getting paid to do this. So this is just strictly something that I was interested in for any of you guys who were needing that disclaimer. Back in the 1700s, there was a large business in England called the East India Company. So they were the trading company that bought and sold goods between Britain and all the various countries and civilizations in Eastern Asia and India and all sorts of places like that, Middle East as well. They got so big that they were able to convince the British government to make them the only business that could buy and sell products with countries in Asia from Britain. So they became what we call a monopoly. They were the only people who could buy or sell things from that part of the world if they were a British company. The British government also passed laws that allowed people to organize their money, put their money together and form an organization. And so this East India Company was one of the first organizations that we now call a corporation, which is, it's a formal way to recognize an organization of people or of one person, but an organization, and it has certain protections. So for those who aren't familiar with it, basically in the eyes of the law, a corporation is a legal person. So it's separate from the people who created it, the people who own it, and the people who run it, right? And so that's why we can talk about if something goes wrong with your car, or if you get sick at a restaurant, or if you slip and fall, or something happens at your job, and you have to end up going to court, right? You're not actually suing the person who happens to be the CEO or the person who owns stock in the company. You're suing this thing called Corporation X. And so that's what the organization was set up for, was allowing for people to do business in a way that, kind of gave them some protection in case things went wrong, or else it'd be hard for people to do business if every time something went wrong, they could lose their whole life. So that's basically kind of why they were created. Corporations can enter contracts, as most of us know. They can borrow money, they can employ people. Many of us work for corporations. Corporations can own property, they can pay taxes. And recently, the Supreme Court of the United States also decided that corporations can exercise free speech. And so in a case called Citizens United that you may hear about, the Supreme Court essentially decided that a corporation also has its own interests and can speak from them the same way you or I could do this podcast and speak about my opinions about politics. You can do the same. A corporation now can, in the form of campaign donations and other things, act as an individual participant in the political system. And so that's going to be an important thing that we have to figure out as a society. What does that mean? And are we comfortable with that? So that's basically what corporations are, and shareholders are the people who own the corporation. For those who aren't familiar kind of with how all that works, so people who start the corporation put their money together, they give the corporation money in exchange. The people who run the corporation give them a piece of the ownership and essentially a piece of the profits that they make. Once you own a piece of the company, you can buy or sell that. You can sell that to someone else. So that's all that's happening on the stock market is I own a piece of this company because I gave them some money or someone did initially. And then I don't feel like owning that anymore, so I'll sell to you for some money, and you may be willing to pay more for my ownership share than I paid for it, which lets me make money. And so that's all that's happening on the stock market is that people are buying and selling pieces of ownership in any particular company. So some of us are not necessarily always familiar with what these things are, so just try to break it down. I'm just touching the surface. The book does a really, really good job of explaining all these concepts, so definitely pick that up if you really want more detail. So some of the pros of corporations are that they're less risky, right? They're more efficient in terms of putting money together. Actually, it's funny because even if you look at people who aren't sort of in the formal, within the legal structure, sort of everybody who's making money ends up doing some form of this. You know, those of you guys who are familiar with the various types of movies and mob movies or hustling movies, at the end of the day, it always ends up like, you know, the quote unquote, the bad guys get together and try to figure out some way to work together to make more money. So that's essentially always what's happening. People are always going to be pooling their resources together. The corporation allows for a legal way to go about doing that. Now, some of the cons are when a corporation, any business gets large and powerful enough, then they start to get special arrangements. And sometimes they get large and powerful because they get special arrangements, oftentimes from the federal government, things that you or I as, you know, employees or just working people, or maybe we have a little small business and we provide a little service, things that we would never get. Sometimes corporation, if it gets in the right position, is able to get things that you or I would never get. And so that's one of the questions, election clapback questions we always have to keep in mind is, what should the government be doing in terms of making sure that everybody gets an opportunity? One of the things that the book talked about, this book, Economix, again, which is the book that inspired this podcast, that really kind of just stopped me in my tracks, was they told the story of some of the first large corporations in the country, which were the railroad companies back kind of around the Civil War time, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. You know, I think many of us know that kind of the railroads were a big deal, definitely were a big deal back then in terms of helping a lot of businesses get their products shipped from coast to coast, obviously connecting people and connecting the whole country it's what helped America sort of really form as a nation when we could go from place to place like that. And so the companies that were around at that time that built the railroads, they got a lot of benefits from the government. The government gave them money, gave them land, gave them all sorts of help to build these things. And so the government does that often, probably many more times than you would think. Those of you who all pay attention to these issues are aware of this, but many more times than the average person thinks. The government helps certain businesses to do what they do. And sometimes it's because what they're doing is very expensive, sometimes because it's for any number of reasons. But one of the things that I'm always pushing back on is a world in which sometimes we're told that, you know, the people who, or the corporations that are in a position of being very, you know, making a lot of money and things like that, we sort of tell ourselves this myth that, you know, oh, well, they just made a lot of money. They sold a lot of products and they did something better. And that's, you know, often true, many times true, most times true, I guess. And then a lot of times, though, they got a lot of help and they got special arrangements that if you got that special arrangement, you'd be doing a little bit better as well. And so it's always important to remember that and to, you know, not pretend like a lot of these institutions did not receive very, very proactive help from the government, which then also becomes a question about when do other people and who and when do we as Americans receive proactive help from the government. Back to the story. So in the 1850s, the railroads were getting a bunch of breaks from the government, and the book goes into it, really well illustrated. And I just want to drop some of the names that became successful at that time, and you'll see how influential the situation was. So in California, there was a guy who was part of it, some large railroads out there by the name of Leland Stanford. So that might sound familiar to folks. Stanford University is named after him. In Chicago, you had people like Richard Sears, who had a mail order goods business where people ordered goods through the mail and he delivered them. That became Sears Department Stores, which is what the Sears Tower, now the Wills Tower, is named after. So a very big deal in Chicago. Definitely people know who he is. Cyrus McCormick, who made farm machines, is kind of one of the patriarchs of the McCormick family, which is a big convention center in Chicago, and so it's named after him. In Pittsburgh, you had Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was into railroads as well. Obviously, Vanderbilt University is named after him. Huge family wealth. Andrew Carnegie, steel was his business, also helped a lot by the railroads. Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, some of you all are familiar with that, the Carnegie Foundation, all types of things. And Andrew Mellon, Mellon Bank, those of you guys who are familiar with Mellon Bank, Carnegie Mellon, like I said, university is named after those two gentlemen. In North Carolina, again, I'm just giving you all the idea of the names. So sometimes, again, we forget in America that there are families and people who've had money for nearly 2 centuries, like have been the wealthiest people on the planet. And so when you sort of get told that, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, we have to think about that in a different light sometimes. In North Carolina, you had a gentleman by the name of Washington Duke. Those of you guys familiar with Duke University, it is named after his family name. New York, you had John D. Rockefeller. So when you see 30 Rock, which refers to Rockefeller Center, which is a series of buildings in the center of Midtown Manhattan, that's named after his family. J.P. Morgan, those of you guys who are J.P. Morgan Chase, you're familiar with his family, that was banking. So all those names all kind of came big at the same time and really became influential. And so one of the things we have to think about, one of the election clapback questions I always challenge people to think about is, right now, those names don't necessarily mean anything negative or positive to us. I like Stanford and Duke University, particularly as a college sports fan. But there were some trade-offs, because these people at the time were people who, whenever you have a lot of wealth and a lot of power, they were able to sit at the table and have a very different conversation than other Americans were at the time. And at the time they were building their wealth, again, we're told, and we talked about in episode 1, definitely check that out if you haven't listened to it, the founding principle of this country being competition and free market. And this guy, Adam Smith, had some ideas about that. But we see that in the 1850s, when those names I was talking about, when they got their start, there were many people literally on this land that we now call the United States of America that weren't considered humans, right? The enslaved peoples from the continent of Africa at the time. And many of our Native American communities may be considered human, definitely not considered American, or at least not as American as other people. Then there were even people who were considered American by the folks in power, and they weren't afforded the same opportunities to compete for contracts or to get some of these benefits and try to start their own businesses. So we always have to be mindful in the moment. We have our own big names now. We have our own people who are very successful and who are head of large companies. And sometimes we can get to a place where we put people on a certain pedestal because they're very successful financially, and I'm not here to count anyone's wallet, and I guess hats off to you. But we as a public can't let, maybe our respect for someone's success and however they or their business were able to achieve that success, we can't let that cloud our judgment. And we always have to, I think, have a healthy skepticism of what happens when someone is able to become very successful, or an organization is able to become very successful, and then what happens when they interact with the government, because then the government comes and interacts with us, and that's not always the same relationship. So if we believe competition is important, and that was something that Adam Smith talked about, his book, we talked about that last time, came out the same year as the Declaration of Independence, which I think was, maybe some coincidence of history. But we talked about that. So if competition is a big deal, and we're always being told by certain folks in these political arguments that competition matters and everything should be about competition and free markets this. So then we as American people have to ask ourselves, okay, well, there's a lot of industries, drug companies, certain drug companies are in the news right now for their pricing situations on certain medications. TV and movie companies, cable and internet, online media companies, cell phone companies, airlines, banks, companies that make seeds for plants and crops, diamonds, meat packing companies, meat producing companies, people who make K-12 textbooks. There are all sorts of areas of our economy where it's not free market competition, right? Where certain folks, either they got there first or they, outmaneuvered everybody else or whatever situation it was. But think about the bills you pay and think about when you buy things, start reading the back of those labels and see how many people actually own stuff and how many companies are there actually, especially in those industries. You'll find that there are very few. And so then the question is, if we like competition, how do we balance that? On the other hand, hotels were running stuff until Airbnb came up. and taxi cabs and cities were running things until Uber came up, and Gillette was sort of owned the raisin market until things like Dollar Shave Club and Bevel came up. So there are occasions where competition is still happening in our economy, and we definitely see that obviously most clearly in technology. But there's a lot of other things that maybe we don't think about where competition is not happening. And so then the question, election clapback question for us in this moment is, what should be the government's approach? When we send people, we vote for certain people from our society to go to Washington or go to our state capital and represent our community. What should they be keeping in mind? Should their goal be to help protect those folks who are already in that number one spot and make sure they're good? Or should their goal be to promote competition? Or should their goal be to help out someone who wants to start something new? And so my encouragement to folks is to not, again, get caught up. Whole purpose of this podcast series is to talk less about the silliness that's going on our TV screens and try to get back to what do you actually believe about how this country should work? You should be able to articulate that and at least have a discussion about what you believe as opposed to just talking about, which personality you like on TV. Second thing I think we need to talk about when talks about corporations and big business is we have to think about, again, these names that I mentioned. How do we balance that? How do we deal with situations where, and I'm not here to say, someone got their money negatively. I'm not necessarily the point of this podcast, but when large wealth is present, either in an individual or in an organization, and then you have government, and obviously we have a situation of political contributions and how much it takes to be an elected official. So when you have all these things together, what should be the approach of the American people? How should we look at that? So just because I like someone's products and I buy their, and I respect that, maybe I respect their story and I respect the organization, or I don't respect them or whatever. Either way, when people with money get with people with power, usually that has some certain consequences. And if the public, the general public, who are not either in either of those two categories, tends to get the end results of that, which sometimes is not always the best. And so we definitely want to keep that in mind. Well, that was the Election Clapback series for today. Next time, we're going to continue and talk about what happened back in just the 1920s, about 100 years ago, which isn't really too long ago, when big businesses and big government got a little reckless and the people had to speak up. So hope you're enjoying the series. Definitely reach out to us. ClassofHC@gmail.com is the email. Again, we're looking to try to expand the conversation and definitely include a whole bunch of voices and try to create a different space in this country for some different dialogue, looking for people of good sense and goodwill. So definitely reach out to us. We're at ClassofHC on all the social media. Thank you all for listening and have a great one.